So, so Lincoln did something I think really interesting. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He announces it rather, and again, it's an executive order. It doesn't have to go through Congress. 5 days after Antietam, he said that he had attempted the border states to act against slavery, but now we have to move forward without them because they're not going to free their slaves. They're not going to let us, the border states, Kentucky, Missouri especially, they're not going to let the government buy their slaves to set an example. We've got to just move forward without them. So he issues it on September 22nd as a military necessity. That he announces it to the public. And he said if the Confederate States did not surrender by January 1st, 1863, their slaves shall be then or thenceforth forever free. And of course, it's important to remember that no slaves were freed in Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware at this point, or any of the territory that had been captured by the Union Army, specifically Tennessee and portions of Virginia. So the paradox that the Emancipation Proclamation, the day that it's signed, does not free one slave. And radicals at the time and historians since have been pretty critical of the Emancipation Proclamation, that they say it's overrated, that it wasn't really that big a deal. Radicals thought it was a pretty weak measure as well. But Frederick Douglass was ecstatic by the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. He had been very, very critical of Lincoln for not freeing the slaves. He said that Lincoln was fighting the war with one hand tied behind his back. Douglass said that the Emancipation Proclamation was the beginning to the end of slavery, and that it would be a moral bombshell, and that's his phrase, to the Confederacy. I think the Massachusetts governor, and you're not going to have to remember this guy's name, it's John Andrews, but he said it really nicely. He said, it's a poor document, but a mighty act. And so it's a promissory note. What the Emancipation Proclamation does is it ties emancipation and the end of slavery to the success of the Union Army. They become intrinsically tied together after Lincoln signs the document on January 1st, 1863. If the Union Army wins the war, the slaves are freed. If the Union Army doesn't win the war, the slaves remain slaves. Now, in that period between the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation and January 1st, Lincoln comes under a lot of pressure to back down. To his credit, he'd issued the Emancipation during an election season, and it could have blown up in his face, but it didn't. In December of 1862, there were rumors that Lincoln was not going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but he talked to some of the few radicals that he talked to, and he said, look, you can trust me on this. Once I make up my mind about something, I go through with it. And Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, one of the radicals, said that Lincoln said to him that he would not stop the proclamation if he could, and could not if he would. So basically Lincoln's saying, look, there's too much momentum here. Nobody can stop it, least of all me, but I don't even want to stop it. In December, Lincoln wrote one of his most famous messages to Congress. It's a beautiful, beautiful wording. He said, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. I love that. We cannot escape history. Nobody can escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the last generation. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. Amazing. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. We must disenthrall ourselves, and we shall save our country. Disenthrall ourselves, that means free ourselves from slavery. Amazing. Lincoln was such a poet. We cannot escape history. Fiery trial. He's thinking about students in March of 2016 looking back on him. He's thinking about the future. He's thinking about how he's going to be seen, and he's warning the people of the North that they're going to be judged for all time on the actions that they take during the Civil War. The great line, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew." Just, I think, brilliant language. So, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. It's kind of an interesting story. The White House was always thrown open on January 1st to public reception, and people could get in. The security was not great. One of the Lincoln's reasons, I think he's killed later, but be that as it may. So on January 1st, Lincoln he's stood in line, and people have come by and they've shook his hand or shaken his hand. What's the past tense? Anyway, shaken. And then he goes up into a room with a couple of his key members of his government. And he's going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but his hand is numb because he's shaken so many hands that day. And he spends a couple of minutes kind of just shaking out. Have you ever had a numb hand and you just kind of shake it out, to get the blood flowing? And the reason he did that was he told people he didn't want his signature to be shaky because he didn't want folks looking at the signature to think that he had any doubt about what he was doing. So he signs it, and what happens is, by signing the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War became what no white person thought it would become when it began in April of 1861. It became a revolution. It became an emancipatory conflict. It became the turning point of U.S. history. And it moves into a hard war. Lincoln, at this point, doesn't care about property, especially when it comes to slavery. He's not having Union troops run wild in the South. But now when it comes to slavery, all slaves in territory that the Union Army recaptures and brings back into the U.S. are now free. The commanding general of U.S. forces, a guy by the name of Halleck, wrote to Grant, "The character of the war has now very much changed within the last year. There is now no possible hope of reconciliation with the rebels. The Union Party in the South is virtually destroyed." In other words, there's no more belief that there are Unionists or pro-U.S. white Southerners anymore. "There can be no peace but what is forced by the sword." Very heavy line. Basically, we're into, I wouldn't call it total war because that has a very specific meaning among military historians, but the chessboard war is over now. There must be no peace but what is forced by the sword. We must conquer the rebels or be conquered by them. Okay, so that's what it's come to. We either conquer the rebels or they conquer us. That is a new way of thinking about the Civil War. And the Civil War, what has happened is the Civil War has exponentially grown into the kind of revolutionary conflict that only a very, very few Americans, mostly African Americans, thought it would grow into in April of 1861. It's become a true revolution, and a lot of historians think that the Civil War was actually more of a revolution in U.S. society than the American Revolution from Great Britain.